Hey everyone, in this video we're going to cover file and folder shares along with permissions. So out of the box, Windows Server does install a file server role here for you. Really all you need to do to share out a file or a folder is just to modify the permissions and open up the firewall so that someone can access that share over the network. But when you do add this particular role, so I went into the Manage, Add, and Remove Roles, and this is the one that comes pre-installed. It gives you this tool. So let me just go back here. I'm one step ahead of myself. Back in the Server Manager, you will see the File and Storage Services. And in the File and Storage Services, you can take a look at your shares. You can see who's connected to those shares, the amount of space they're using up, quotas as well. You can also work with your volumes and your disks. Right now, we, in this particular video, are not covering working with the volumes and disks. So again, you don't really need to install anything through the add remove features because that file server is checked automatically, and that's going to allow people to connect to your server for a shared file or folder. There are a few different kind of advanced features, I will call them. In our class, we will work with the File Server Resource Manager, so you guys will install this. This will allow you to do things like run reports on your server, to see if maybe there's duplicate files in your shares or files that maybe haven't been accessed in 6 months or a year or whatever criteria you specified. You could do searches for very large files. Again, just kind of allows you to monitor and manage the file server. Another thing that you can do with the File Server Resource Management role is you can block certain files from being stored on the server. So maybe you don't want like executables or batch files because those could be potential malware. You can block those. Maybe you don't want MP4s or MP3s because those tend to take up more space. You could block those file types, so it does it based on extension. And then the last thing that it allows you to do is run disk quotas. The disk quotas through File Server Resource Manager is the most powerful compared to NTFS quotas because it allows you to do it on a per user or per group basis. And then it allows you also to maybe run a script if someone gets over a quota, maybe send them an email if they get over their quota, log an event, do a variety of things. So we'll explore that actually in the lab. So in order to share out a file and folder, just going to do one here real quick. Now this is not advisable to share out a file or a folder on the desktop, and that is because the desktop is part of a user's profile. So a lot of people get in the habit of just creating a folder on the desktop and sharing it out. Well, if I take a look at the actual location, this is in the C Users Administrator desktop. This is inside the profile of the administrator. So what you should do instead is, now typically on a good server setup, you have a separate data drive. In our VM, we only have our C drive. But maybe you have a C drive for the OS and a D drive for the data, or E drive for the data. You'd go into your E drive and set up a folder. Again, we just have one folder, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, under the root of my C, a new folder called Share. Now, to share this out, this is the way I advocate. A lot of people, again, kind of get into the habit of going like this and kind of using this wizard, which tends to work just fine. However, you kind of run out of some fine-grained capability and some advanced capability. So I'm going to kind of do it the old school manual way. I'm going to right-click. I'm going to choose Properties. I'm going to come to the Sharing tab, and I am going to choose the Advanced Sharing. Again, you could kind of use that same wizard, but you're going to lose out on some capability. So Advanced Sharing, because we're advanced administrators. So I choose Share This Folder, and I give it a name. Maybe I want to share it with a different name than what the folder is. I can do that. So the folder name is Share, but maybe I want to share it out as, Documents. I can do that. Maybe I want to share it out as Group, because a group of people are going to connect to it. Usually it will match the name of the folder, and so that's fine. Here's some of the kind of fine-grained or advanced features. I can limit the number of simultaneous users. I can add comments. I can enable caching here for offline access. But mainly I'm more concerned about the permissions. So with share permissions, I have just 3: full control, change, and read. I'm going to talk about calculating permissions here in a few moments, but best practice, the way to make it easy, is come in here and for everyone, give everyone full control through the share permission. And then lock it down in terms of how you want the access to really work through the security tab. Because when we have share permissions and the security tab permissions at work, there's a little calculation we have to do. And again, I'll go through that here in just a few minutes. So maybe I truly want everyone to have modify. So I can come in here and I can add the everyone group. It's actually not a group, it's a special identity, because you don't explicitly add people to this, you just are part of everyone. And then I again lock it down. So if I want everyone to have modify, I would come in here and I would choose modify. And now what I have is I have a shared folder. And if I go back into the properties under the sharing tab, this shows me what's known as the UNC. The UNC is going to be / the name of the server / the name of the share. And that's how someone would connect to it. So if I am on a different computer and I want to connect to this folder, what I would have to do, well, I can do it through the search. I can go / name of the server, which is server DC, / name of the share. See, it starts to populate. There's server DC share. And now I'm connecting to this folder over the network. So when I'm connecting to it over the network, I have my share and my NTFS or security tab permissions at play. If I'm just on the local machine in which the folder exists, which I happen to be here, so I'm on the local machine and I browse to it, the only thing that takes that's taken into account for permissions is this security tab, and that's known as your NTFS permissions. But when you connect to it over the network, so if someone's on a different computer, let's pretend this is a Windows 10 computer, I'm just an average user, I want to connect to that shared folder on the server, I type in / the name of the server, our first server happens to be server DC, and then the name of the share. And then I connect to it. And then based on my permissions, maybe I can come in here and create new documents. Maybe I can delete documents out of there, whatever my permissions happen to be. As you can imagine, connecting to shares that way can be a little difficult because users would have to remember that naming convention. They would have to remember the name of the server. They would have to then remember also the name of the share. So we have an option that we can do, and you guys will do this in the lab, and that is mapping a drive. So when you map a drive, it actually shows up for the user under this PC as a drive letter. And so they don't have to type in that naming convention every time. They can just come under File Explorer or My Computer, and they would see, for example, a G drive or an F drive. So in order to do that, typically you create a script. I'm just going to do a single one-time run, so this would not be persistent. But I would do something like this, net use. I'll just do the G drive for group, we'll pretend. And then I would type in path, and it was server DC / share. Command completed successfully. So now when I go under my PC, here I see this G drive for the user. And so if I did this persistently through a script or through another way I'm about to show you, this would show up every time I start up the computer. Quick double-click access to that shared folder. Okay, so I'm actually connecting to that share on server DC. Another way you can map the drive is if you go under this PC, you see drive tools up here. Nope, that's actually not what I want. Under computer, You can do map drive, and then you have a little bit of a GUI-based wizard. Choose your drive letter, choose S drive this time, and then you could either browse for it or type in the path. If you need to connect using different credentials, you can also select that. Note when you browse, it's going to attempt to browse over the network. Sometimes this is a little hit and miss depending on firewall rules and whatnot. So what I typically do is I just, again, type in that UNC path, Universal Naming Convention path, server DC/share. Okay. So now I have a share out here, and people are, adding files to it, or they're accessing files on here, and you want a little bit more fine-grained control. That's where that file server resource manager comes in, being able to run reports, set quotas, file screens to block certain types, and those sorts of things. All right, I want to talk a little bit about permissions, because when you share a folder, you're going to want to set permissions. First thing I'll mention here is when you go and you set up a folder, so I have my share folder. Whoops, I'll go into properties. I have the security tab. Again, these are called NTFS permissions because they were made available when the NTFS file system came out. NTFS file permissions are cumulative. They're considered cumulative because, for example, let's pretend I have the user Matt. And let's see, do I have the user Matt? Let's see if I can just add him. I do. So I have the user Matt. And let's pretend Matt is part of the IT group. And Matt is also part of the marketing group. So for the IT group, we just give the permissions for the folder of read and execute, list folder contents, and read. So what this essentially means, they're going to be able to look inside the folder, they'll be able to run any applications or programs that are inside of it, and they'll be able to list what's inside of it. Then under marketing, we go ahead and we give modify. So Matt will pretend is part of both of those groups, so he's part of IT and he's part of marketing. Well, what permission is he going to get? It's going to be whatever gives him the most power. So I said they're cumulative. IT only gives him read, essentially. Marketing gives him the ability to modify. So in the end, what Matt's going to be able to do is Matt's going to be able to modify. So whatever gives him the most permission. Let's say we go explicitly add Matt. We explicitly add Matt to the list. So I have the IT, which he's a part of, listed. I have marketing, which he's a part of, listed. And then Matt, specifically, I come in here and I give him full control. So what is Matt going to be able to do now? Is he going to be able to read that IT has? Is he going to be modify that marketing has? Or is he going to have full control, which is explicitly set to his account? Explicit permissions will override the group permission. So if you explicitly list somebody here, they are going to get whatever permissions are listed here, even if it's less. So if I came in here and I deny Matt, you want to be real careful with denies. Denies override allows, and sometimes you can end up locking yourself out. I do not advocate using denies unless you need to. If I don't want Matt to have access, don't list him or any of his groups. Sometimes that's impossible, or you can't, list a group that he's a part of. So in this case, if I didn't want Matt, using a deny would work just fine. But usually you just try not to list that particular user or group and try to do it that way. But anyways, now Matt is explicitly denied permission. Even though the marketing group has access and the IT group that he's a part of has access, it does not matter because Matt is explicitly listed there. Okay, so I'm just going to cancel that out. Another option that you do have is to go into the Advanced tab in the Effective Access. You can plug in a user here. And then you can choose this View Effective Access, and it's going to kind of give you a little report of all the individual permissions that he has. So he's going to be able to have full control and do all of these things. Delete subfolders, change permissions, take ownership, all those different things. So that's a nice little tool you can use as well. What I usually say for the permissions is the name kind of says it all. So if you can modify things in the file and folder. You can modify the folder itself. If you can read the folder, you can read things in the folder. You can't really change anything. Share permissions are a little bit less fine-grained. There's only 3. There's read, change, and full control. Here's what happens when you start to calculate your share and folder permission. Now I have this document in the class shell, but just for a visual for us. Let's pretend we have this user J Smith, and we go explicitly list J Smith here for read, and we go and we explicitly list, not explicitly list, he's part of the users group. J Smith is part of the users group. So the user group was given read for share, the user group is given read for NTFS. For manager, nothing's assigned, so if we looked under the share permissions, we wouldn't see the manager list there. So essentially what that means, we come in here, here's our list, and the only thing we see right now is everyone. So the manager list isn't listed here. But on that list, we do see the admin group listed. For NTFS, we see admin listed as well, has modify. For the manager group, it's read and execute. So what you do is you calculate each side individually. So J Smith, he's part of all 3 of these groups. What gives him the most access there? Well, read versus change. So change gives him the most access there, okay? The NTFS, again, I said they're cumulative. So what gives him the most access on the NTFS side? Read and execute, and modify. Now what you do is you take a look at these 2 individually, and you ask yourself, between these 2, what would give you the least amount of power? Well, you kind of have to know what change gives you and modify, but change is a little bit more restrictive. So in the very end, what J Smith is going to be able to do when connecting to the share over the network, so either he connected through a mapped drive or he used that UNC, he's only going to be able to change, okay? When he connects to that folder on the actual machine where that folder exists, so he's not connecting over the network, so he's not connecting over a mapped drive, he's not connecting over a UNC, he's actually sitting in front of the computer where the folder exists, then only NTFS permissions come into play, and he would be able to modify. Let's do another example here. Let's pretend this is set to read. And this over here is set to modify. Okay, so what gives him the most power over here? Read, nothing assigned or read. Well, it's going to be read. So read gives him the most power for share. And then what gives him the most power for the NTFS side? Read and execute or modify. Modify does. And now between read and modify, what gives him the least amount of power? Well, read does. So we have a little bit of a kind of a mismatch here. When J Smith connects to the folder over the share, again a map drive or UNC, he's only going to be able to read, not a whole lot of power. However, on the NTFS side, when he connects to it locally, he's able to modify. So it gets a little confusing when you combine the permissions. So what I say to make it easy is on the share side, don't list specific groups, just list everyone and always check the everyone for full control. That way the share side is always going to evaluate to full control, and then essentially whatever you set on the security tab is going to be the overall effective permission when connecting over the share or connecting locally. So that's kind of your foolproof way. Come in here, share it out. On the permissions tab, give everyone full control. This side will always evaluate to full control. And then whatever you want to truly happen in the end, set that on the security side. So if I go back and do that over here, what I would do is I would just list the everyone group. And on the everyone, I would flip it to full control from read. And I wouldn't assign on the share tab any other groups. And then let's say in the end, what I wanted Jay Smith to be able to do and the manager group to be able to do is I wanted them to have, we'll say read and execute. So what gives them the most power for share? Well, it's only one listed, full control. Always going to evaluate to that. Between this over here, what gives them the most control? We have read twice and then read and execute. Read and execute gives them a little bit more. And now between the two, what gives him the least amount of power? Well, it's going to be this side. So it's always going to evaluate to whatever you have set on the NTFS side. So that's the easiest way, pretty foolproof way. Now, if you have a folder like we do, and you start to move it around or copy it maybe from one disk to another, the basic rule is if you copy a folder, it's going to inherit the permissions from the parent folder. If you move it, so you cut it instead of copy it, cut and paste versus copy and paste here. If you move it, it retains the permissions, or it remains the same. Okay, I guess what I would mention there is if you're going to be moving around files and folders and you do have permissions on them for shares or whatnot, just go back in after you copy or move it and check the permissions. Again, how do you check? Just go into the properties of that folder. So if, let's say, I move this from the C drive over to a D drive, just come into the properties, check what the sharing permissions currently have set to see if that changed at all. And then also check the NTFS. And that NTFS side is really where it's going to change. Is it inheriting the permissions of a different folder, or what's happening? If you do not want inheritance, so let's say I move this to a folder. And let me just demonstrate inheritance here real quick. So share folder, I set all these security permissions, right? I added everyone, I added the IT, I added Matt marketing. If I come in here and create a subfolder, it's going to inherit all of the permissions of the parent folder. Oops, the properties of that. So there it is, those same groups, everyone, IT, Matt, marketing, all of that. If I didn't want it to inherit, I could come in here and I could choose disable inheritance, and then it's saying, well, it currently has some inherited permissions. What do you want to do with those? Do you want to convert them to explicit permissions, or do you want to remove that inheritance? I want to remove the inheritance. And so now if I come in here and look, no one has access. Okay, I've effectively locked myself out of this folder, which is not good. So I'll give my administrators full control. That way I can at least delete it, whoops, and get rid of it. Okay, so be careful with denies, be careful with disabling inheritance. You can kind of effectively lock yourself out of a folder. I hope that gives you a decent understanding into some permissions. For a little bit of extra help, I do have this permissions document in the class shell, which goes through some scenarios and explains it. I do have some slides, which are kind of a mashup of a few different slide shows that have some examples and talk a little bit about how the calculations work as well. And then I have a couple of videos from YouTube that I thought were pretty good for calculating permissions as well. That's all I have for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But thanks for watching.